Have you ever heard of Billy the Kid, the outlaw who supposedly killed 21 men before he even reached the age of 21? It's one of the most famous legends of the American West, told and retold in dime novels, movies, and campfire stories. But here's the twist. Before the newspapers made him larger than life, before Hollywood cast him as either a cold-blooded villain or a misunderstood hero, Billy the Kid was just Henry McCarty. He was a skinny teenager with sharp eyes, a polite smile, and a life full of hardship. In today's story, we're going to pull back the curtain on those early years and separate myth from fact. We'll walk the crowded immigrant streets of New York, travel across the dusty frontier, and see how an orphan boy grew into one of the most recognizable figures in American history. And trust me, some of these details are going to surprise you. Henry McCarty's story begins in New York City around 1859, though the exact details remain a little fuzzy, like so much of his life. Most historians believe he was born in the Irish immigrant neighborhood of Manhattan's Lower East Side. Picture this: narrow streets filled with tenement buildings, laundry strung across alleyways, the noise of street vendors selling bread and coal, and children running barefoot through the crowded blocks. This was not the glamorous New York of Broadway theaters or Wall Street banks. This was survival territory for poor immigrant families. Henry's father died when Henry was very young, leaving his mother, Catherine, to raise him and his younger brother Joseph on her own. Catherine was a tough, determined woman, but life in Manhattan during the 1860s was unforgiving. She took on sewing jobs, laundry work, anything that might keep food on the table. Historian Robert Utley, in his book Billy the Kid, A Short and Violent Life, points out that Catherine was constantly searching for a better environment for her boys, a place where they could grow up with opportunities instead of hunger. That determination would soon send the family westward. Neighbors who later recalled Henry's childhood described him as clever, cheerful, and surprisingly well-mannered. One woman even remembered him as the boy who offered to carry her groceries rather than sneak an apple from her orchard. Imagine that. The boy who would one day be called the terror of the West was once praised as the polite kid on the block. If newspapers had written about him back then, the headline might have been, "Local boy helps old lady carry groceries." By the late 1860s, Catherine packed up her boys and left New York. First, she tried Indiana, then Kansas, and eventually New Mexico. Each move was fueled by the hope that life might improve, that her children might have more than cramped rooms and endless city labor. Imagine the journey: long wagon rides, nights by campfires, endless miles of prairie stretching to the horizon. For young Henry, the West must have looked like a wide-open adventure, though it was also full of dangers. In 1873, Catherine remarried a man named William Antrim, and together they moved to Silver City, New Mexico. Silver City was a mining town, rough around the edges but buzzing with energy. It wasn't the kind of place where children had much protection. There were saloons on every corner, miners from every background, and plenty of opportunity, but also plenty of temptation. Still, to Catherine, it was a chance for stability. Sheriff Pat Garrett, who would later become Henry's hunter and biographer, admitted in his book The Authentic Life of Billy the Kid that Henry wasn't naturally vicious. At this point, he was simply a clever, cheerful boy trying to fit into a new frontier life. But fate had other plans. But tragedy struck in 1874. Catherine, who had long battled tuberculosis, died in Silver City. Henry was just 14 years old. Losing his mother was the single most important turning point in his life. His stepfather drifted away, and suddenly Henry and his brother were left with no family, no home, and no guidance. Think about that. A polite, skinny teenager, now completely on his own in a mining town filled with saloons, gamblers, and men twice his size. Neighbors later remembered Henry as resourceful and quick to smile. But behind that smile was a boy who had to grow up overnight. This was the moment when Henry's path forked. Without his mother, without stability, he had to find ways to survive. And survival in the Wild West often meant bending the rules, or breaking them. Some say history is about great wars and leaders. But for Henry, history turned on something far simpler: the loss of the only person who reminded him to do his homework. After his mother's death, Henry bounced between odd jobs. He washed dishes in hotels, carried buckets for boarding houses, helped out at ranches, and did whatever small tasks could earn him a meal or a few coins. People who knew him in these years often described him as polite, quick, with a joke, and, surprisingly, charming. He wasn't the grim outlaw painted in dime novels. If anything, he seemed like a kid trying to make the best of a rough hand. But charm doesn't pay rent, and smiles don't buy bread. As an orphan teenager in Silver City, Henry struggled to survive. When odd jobs dried up, he sometimes stole to keep himself going. In a town where every other boy carried a slingshot or pocket knife and most men carried pistols, a little theft wasn't unusual. But for Henry, one small theft would become the spark that lit his legend. In 1875, at just 15 years old, Henry was arrested for the first time for stealing food. A short while later, he was caught stealing clothes from a Chinese laundry in Silver City. This was no grand heist. He wasn't robbing banks or trains. He was a hungry kid swiping what he needed to get by. But in a frontier town, even small crimes could land you in a rough jail. The jail was little more than an adobe building, dark and smoky from the fireplace. Henry, small and wiry, found his way out, literally, by climbing up the chimney and escaping into the night. It was his first jailbreak, and it wouldn't be his last. Locals must have laughed when they heard about it. The polite orphan boy who slipped out of jail like smoke. But for Henry, it was more than a prank. It was freedom. And it showed him he could outwit the authorities if he needed to. If Yelp had existed back then, Henry might have left a review. Too smoky. Not enough ventilation. Escape through the chimney. Would not recommend. After leaving Silver City, Henry began drifting through the Southwest. He worked when he could, stole when he couldn't, and began experimenting with new names. Sometimes he called himself Henry Antrim, after his stepfather. Other times, he went by William Bonney. But the nickname that stuck was the Kid. He was young, wiry, and fearless. Soon enough, newspapers caught wind of the name and turned it into Billy the Kid. From that point on, the line between Henry McCarty the boy and Billy the Kid, the legend began to blur. The press painted him as a cold-blooded killer, exaggerating every rumor and incident. But the truth is that the foundation of his legend wasn't built on violence alone. It was built on poverty loss and the desperate struggle of an orphan trying to find his place in a harsh world. And so, by the mid-1870s, Henry McCarty had transformed into Billy the Kid. Not because he chose to become an outlaw, but because life kept pushing him down paths where survival meant breaking rules. This is just the beginning of his story. In our next chapter, we'll step into the Lincoln County War, a violent conflict in New Mexico that would turn the skinny, polite orphan boy into a household name across America. So stick around, because the story of Billy the Kid is about to get even wilder.